It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. Good morning, everyone. We have Jimmy Wales coming up on today's show, co-founder of Wikipedia. Wikipedia is turning 25 years old. We'll talk about political controversies surrounding it right now, like a lot of people on the right call it Wokepedia. Elon Musk even started an alternative AI version that he calls Grokpedia. But Jimmy Wales is going to celebrate the 25th anniversary of Wikipedia and talk about his new book that's somewhat of a history and somewhat of a blueprint for restoring trust in the world, which is one of the missions that he sees for Wikipedia. The book is called The 7 Rules of Trust. So Jimmy Wales coming up. Also later, we're going to have a call-in on what you do when you quit social media, even if you just quit it temporarily. Jay Caspian-Kang wrote about this in The New Yorker. He's going to join us. One of the things he was interested in is whether people read more books when they take a social media holiday. So we'll take your calls and talk to Jay Caspian-Kang about that later. But we start here. There has been yet another act of war, I think it's fair to call it, between the Trump administration and Venezuela, and another act of culture war by the Trump administration toward Europe, which matters domestically, too. Regarding Venezuela, President Trump announced that the U.S. has seized an oil tanker off the Venezuelan coast. He said, quote, "It was seized for a very good reason." We'll see if we can figure out what he thinks the reason is. And about the oil, he said, quote, "Well, we keep it, I guess." Venezuela called the seizure a barefaced robbery and an act of international piracy. Interestingly, and maybe complicating your thinking on this year's Nobel Peace Prize winner, the Venezuelan opposition leader, Maria Corina Machado, is in Oslo, Norway, where the Peace Prize ceremony was just held. The New York Times says Ms. Machado has been a steadfast supporter of President Trump's pressure campaign against Mr. Maduro, whom the Trump administration has accused of flooding the United States with drugs and criminals. Today, Ms. Machado dodged a reporter's question, the Times says, about her views on the threat of U.S. military action in Venezuela, but she repeated the Trump administration's talking points on Maduro's government, comparing him to a criminal mastermind engaged in a vast array of illegal activities in partnership with America's adversaries. So that's part of the Venezuela story. Then the release of the Trump administration's national security strategy last week that Americans and the rest of the world are still digesting. Fred Kaplan on Slate calls it, among other things, rah-rah supportive of European ultranationalist parties that oppose immigration. We'll talk to Fred in just a minute. One example of that, though, there's a section called Promoting European Greatness, which says Europe is facing, quote, the prospect of civilization erasure. Civilization erasure. It warns that many of its countries will, quote, become majority non-European, unquote. The president reinforced that in an interview with Politico this week.
Well, Europe is a different place.
What do you mean by that?
And if it keeps going the way it's going, Europe will not be, in my opinion, many of those countries will not be viable countries any longer. Their immigration policy is a disaster.
Immigration policy. So the document, though officially a national security strategy assessing threats from the outside world, also aims related culture war slings and arrows domestically, with lines like a stated goal of the, quote, retention and reinvigoration of American spiritual and cultural health, which includes, quote, strong traditional families that raise healthy children. On the healthy children part, we might note that it says nothing about their cuts to SNAP benefits and health insurance coverage, so presumably the traditional families part of that section is the point. With us now is Fred Kaplan, who writes the War Stories column for Slate and is author of The Bomb, Presidents, Generals, and the Secret History of Nuclear War, and many other books about U.S. military and foreign policy. Fred, thanks for coming on. Welcome back to WNYC.
Good to be here.
Let's start with the national security strategy document, and then we'll get to Venezuela. What does the security strategy tell you about how the Trump administration sees the world?
Well, if this document didn't exist and we went through talking about, what Trump believes about this, that, or the other thing, we'd kind of come to the same conclusions. Uh, what makes it different is that it is all written down on a piece of on 30 pieces of paper. It's a 30-page document. Uh, and a lot of foreign governments tend to take these kinds of documents. As one person I know who used to write these kinds of things put it, they tend to read them a lot more carefully than we write them. They look at these as statements of doctrine and draw conclusions from them. And to the extent that there are contradictory things within them, as there are in this document, they often focus on the parts that are most worrisome to them. And you outline some of those very things.
Yeah. Well, on this alleged civilization erasure, as the document calls it, that Europe is allegedly headed for, it also says, quote, "We want Europe to remain European," which you call a barely disguised euphemism for "we want Europe to remain white." Does it make or even try to make any serious case that has any relevance to U.S. national security?
No, this goes back to Vice President Vance's speech at the Munich conference last year, where he really quite explicitly made a campaign plea for the far right. It really is no exaggeration to call them neo-Nazi parties in Germany. And he criticized the German government for trying to put limits on their position in the government, on the banning of literature that we would call Nazi. Certain aspects of the First Amendment, it might not be the best thing to apply to a country that's been through all the hell that Germany has been through over the past couple hundred years. And one should allow a certain amount of suppression of certain ideas because they're quite live and easy to rile. And in the meantime, really, Vance, Trump, the whole lot have no business talking about freedom of speech when Trump says just the other day that it is an act of treason for the New York Times to publish questions about his health publicly. He really did say this. It's the double standards are just, appalling doesn't begin to summarize them.
But I keep coming back to immigration. Why are those domestic cultural references in there, domestic ones? Retention of U.S. cultural health, including strong traditional families. If this is supposed to be a national security document, which presumably looks at threats from the outside world.
Well, I think to the extent that it is a foreign policy document, in some ways it's to express, rather strongly a measure of identity with those far right-wing parties in Europe. Like, you guys are on the right track. We want to head that way too. On the other hand, it's also very much a political document, a domestic political document. The whole introduction, and this kind of thing has never been stated, even mildly, in any national security strategy document that I've seen. The whole first section is a chest-thumping exercise in praising all the great things that Trump has done. It's self-boosting. It is a boosterish document, and I think a lot of the business about traditional families and so forth is to be read in that context.
I guess, but I think it's more than that. Like this foreign policy document, as I say, I think it reveals something about his domestic immigration policy. Mm-hmm. And to that point, I want to play another clip of the president that I've never thought has gotten as much attention as it maybe deserved, relevant to tying these two strands together, U.S. place in the world and domestic immigration policy. This is from his UN General Assembly speech in September.
Proud nations must be allowed to protect their communities and prevent their societies from being overwhelmed by people they have never seen before, with different customs, religions, with different everything.
And that was in September. And I'm going to add to that on this week on Tuesday at his rally in Pennsylvania, which was purportedly about the economy, he confirmed the remark that was reported during his first term that he never admitted before, that he called many countries in Africa and elsewhere S-hole countries, and asked why can't we have, quote, nice people, he said on Tuesday, like from Denmark and Norway. So, Fred, he's literally saying the quiet part out loud now, isn't he?
And more recently than that, he said, he's basically banned refugees from coming to this country, with the notable exception of white Afrikaners in South Africa, whom he says are being subjected to genocide. Even many white Afrikaners in South Africa have disputed that allegation. But yeah, no, you're right. The thing that's remarkable about Trump is that he very rarely has to resort to what we call dog whistles. He says it out loud at frequencies that we can all hear. And it remains remarkable to me. The most remarkable thing, and not just in foreign policy, but about every aspect of this administration, is, I'm not surprised by very much of what he has done or said. I am surprised by the lack of resistance within the Republican Party, which was not always a monomaniacal pro-MAGA party. And I think if you have private conversations with many Republicans, still isn't. But there's this fear the kind of thing that really shouldn't take much conscience at all to stand up and object to. And we're not seeing it. And we're not even seeing that much systematic of it within the Democratic Party. That's the part of American politics that is really stunning me the most these days.
We did a segment this week about data that shows only 5% of the immigrants detained by ICE this year have violent criminal records, and nearly half don't even have criminal charges against them. So taking that plus his S-hole countries remark and this national security document together, it seems like we should stop pretending the immigration debate is about crime, which we used to hear a lot, right? And have the national conversation about what it's really for, resisting too much racial and cultural change.
No, you're right. And the other thing, Brian, is that this shows such an ignorance of American history, and even an American history of which Trump's family is a part. A couple generations ago, his family came from Germany. The kinds of things being said about, people from S-hole countries, as you put it now, are remarkably similar to the kinds of things that were said 100 years ago about Italian immigrants, Irish immigrants, Jewish immigrants, German immigrants. We weren't always white, Brian, you and I. So
that's right. Although we had a listener who sent us a text on this historical point the other day when we were doing that immigration data segment that said, at least people like you and I, people from Eastern and Southern Europe, could eventually be taken into the category of white. People from Africa, a lot of darker-skinned people from Latin America, some people from parts of Asia, will never have that luxury.
That's true, but I think there was always a tendency to accept, at least out loud in public, that these people could become Americans.
Right. As Ronald Reagan did, by the way.
As Ronald Reagan
care
had
where
that
you
comment.
come from. You want to be an American, we want you here.
Yeah, he said if you emigrate to France, Germany, whatever, you're never really going to become French or German. But if you come to America, you can become an American. That was Ronald Reagan, and I think, I don't think I'm being sentimentalizing about this. I think to some extent, not as much of an extent as we would like maybe, but to some extent, this used to be true. and at least presidents would try to put forth rhetoric that at least made it seem that they accepted the ideal. And Trump has quite explicitly saying, no, we're not about that. And if you feel that way, you can express it openly. You don't have to crawl under a rock and churn your racist views privately. You can talk about it right up front, and you can act about it too. That's kind of one of the horrors of this era.
Listeners, your comments or questions for Fred Kaplan, who writes the Foreign Policy and Military-Oriented War Stories column from Slate on Trump's national security strategy or military actions toward Venezuela, which we'll get to, 212-433-WNYC, 212-433-9692. As some pushback to some of the things we've been saying and some of the things that a lot of critics in this country, not to mention how they're freaking out in Europe. I saw that the headline in Le Monde in France, after they released the national security strategy here, was Trump declares war on Europe. So that's an indication of the reaction there. But there's a New York Times op-ed by Christopher Caldwell, who leans right, called Trump is not attacking Europe, he's attacking something else. And he acknowledges that the document refers to becoming non-European. But then he goes on to quote another line, as such, it is an open question whether they will view their place in the world or their alliance with the United States in the same way as those who signed the NATO Charter. That's in the document, too. So Christopher Caldwell concludes or argues the administration is not arguing that people of this or that national origin are better than others. It argues that the nations of Europe are actual places with distinct cultural and civilizational qualities on the basis of which they make peace and go to war. So he's arguing that there are, at least down the road, potential national security implications for the United States.
Well, the irony of this is that for a variety of reasons, the European nations are doing more now to boost their defense budgets, to do serious on-the-ground operational military planning, actual calculations about, how many tanks, how many rounds of ammunition do we need in certain scenarios, rather than viewing the defense budget as strictly a theatrical gesture.
Which, by the way, Trump wants them to do. These countries that he's afraid won't be allies at the same time as asking them to build up their militaries.
Yeah, and they're doing that. And, comparing this with the willingness of the Europeans to subordinate themselves to American will back when the NATO Charter was signed in 1949, that's a rather high bar. Europe was still flat on its back from the damages of World War II. They had no choice, and in fact, they had no choice but to do whatever the United States wanted, and actually they were fine with that, given the still quite present Soviet threat on the other side of the Iron Wall, but the Iron Curtain. But look. I understand what he's talking about. Look, there is a distinction between patterns of immigration where there is a fairly rapid absorption of American or European cultural pattern. Assimilation is quite rapid and willing, and there are certain kinds of immigration today that are not. And part of this has to do with air travel. Any immigrant can go back to the native country quite often. And language barriers persist, whereas before anybody who came here learned English quite rapidly. And, I can see why some people are disturbed by this. But, that doesn't, the fact that it might have as much to say about our ability, or certain European, especially France's ability to absorb immigrants and to make them feel at home, than it does about, the character of the people coming here. And when you have things now, there was a story in the New York Times the other day about how a lot of people from Latin America are now immigrating to Spain instead of the United States. They fly to Spain, they overstay their visas, and then they apply for residency. And the government in Spain, which is quite left-wing toward this kind of subject, gladly takes them. Now, at the same time, Spain is not granting similar benefits to Africans trying to enter the country by boat, right? So, I mean, we all have our problems in this respect. But you know, when you're going around, when you have ICE agents arresting people because of the way they look, and that's all, how can you expect recent immigrants or even non-recent to feel like they too are Americans and should conduct themselves accordingly?
Jack in Coney Island, you're on WNYC. Hi, Jack.
Coney Island. Welcome to Coney Island. My name is Jack. I grew up here all my life with Coney Island, Seagate, and of course Trump Village. My brother-in-law worked for Trump organization for 36 years. He died 3 years ago. And we have to understand that Donald Trump's dad, he was a racist. He got dragged into court back in the early 80s because he didn't want to rent to black people. And then, so I, reluctantly, I have to say this, but like father, like son, he's a racist too. Because Trump is Germanic, Irish, mixed, whatever, just like all the presidents, even Obama, his mother was Irish. They're all mixed. And, you know, they forget that they committed genocide. There's no more. When Henry Hudson came to Coney Island is called Coney Island. It means Raccoon Island through Henry Hudson when he came in 1622. He bought Manhattan for $25, whatever they did. And I mean, look at it. And where are the natives? Well, and that's the point. So, you know, Europeans are great, but the problem is they cannot forget that to be an American, you have to repent and realize that even the amigos, the Mexicans, they've been here for 12,000 years or more. So, you know, the Europeans took Arizona, Mexico. But what I'm trying to say is there's a need for a correction of sin, both locally, nationally, and globally. And the world has to get together. We have to create a fourth. We have to create a third UN, not after a nuclear war. And Germany is rearing its ugly head on those neck of the woods, and now they're starting to supply weapons, make weapons. Oh my goodness! So this shows you that here we go for the third time. It looks like that's where it's going. The handwriting's on the wall, and we're going to have a war, like not a conventional war. So
I don't know if we're heading toward World War III. We'll get Fred's take on that. But Jack, thank you for your call, and I will say that you may be the only caller in the history of the show who entered singing. So. Thank you very much for your call.
Not Fred, a bad trend, I think, by the way.
I encourage it with other callers, you know, as long as you're not going to make people cringe too much. But, you know, when he talks about the Trumps, I mean, there's so much in his call that we could discuss and pick apart and critique and agree with and whatever. But, you know, it reminds me that was it Trump's father or a generation before that who changed the name to Trump? Yeah, it was Drumpf, because they thought they were going to be discriminated against because they were German.
Yeah, and they you know, they would have been. Yeah, absolutely. You know, the thing is this, that there's a lot of stuff, and there's a couple of passages in this national security strategy about this too. Like, let's not talk about the dark side of American history. Let's emphasize the glories. You know, there have been patterns to take references to slavery out of exhibits at the Smithsonian, because this just makes us feel guilty, and we can't rise to our glories and so forth.
And not only to slavery. I mean, Jack talks about in his phone call the stealing of what we now call the United States from the indigenous people, and talk about civilization erasure, which the foreign policy document that Trump released warns Europe of. We can't even have Indigenous Peoples Day anymore in parallel with or replacing Columbus Day, according to the Trump administration, because it's too politically incorrect. Yeah.
I think what they miss, there is a way of discussing these things. In fact, I think there is a necessity to discuss these things without falling into patterns of guilt and constant remorse and self-abnegation. But to be an American, just to focus on us for a minute, to improve our ability to meet the ideals that are laid out in the founders' documents and so forth, you have to address the shortcomings, the shortfalls, and how to narrow the gap between ideals and reality. That's part of what being a thinking American is, just as in Germany. I mean, there are people in the far right parties in Germany, which Trump and Musk and Vance have celebrated, which say, oh, all these people who want us to have Nazi memorials and so forth, it just makes us feel bad. We want to ignore all of that, while, of course, actually absorbing Nazi ethos. But no, some of the Germany, especially Berlin, is a city that has addressed its nightmare histories in very creative ways. And most people in Berlin, for a while, some of these steps were quite controversial, but they actually view this with some pride of, yes, we are addressing this, we are acknowledging this, and by doing so, we can better move beyond it.
One more call on this before we pivot to the seizure of an oil tanker by the United States off the coast of Venezuela. Monique in Tarrytown, you're on WNYC. Hi, Monique.
Hi. Thank you for taking my call. You guys have covered so many topics this morning, but I'd like to just bring attention to immigration. And actually, this is really about immigration. And I just wanted to say that all this outrage is meaningless unless there's legislation, because you can have all the nation that you want, but unless we do something as a democratic republic. And there is a legislation, which is the Dignity Act. It's bipartisan. It's getting absolutely no traction. And my cynical view is that we don't want to solve this issue because that's what's driving our politicians on both sides. And I just encourage everyone to look into the Dignity Act. I'd love for it to be featured in one of your, but we need solutions. All of this indignation without legislation is meaningless. And if I can make a second point, is that, the whole idea of assimilation. Before your program was the BBC was highlighting the carnage that's going on in Marseille. And we need to think about the fact that there are certain core values that are in our Constitution about respecting law, respecting life. And those just go back to the Ten Commandments, which is part of our Judeo-Christian tradition, which is, it's not about your melanin. It's not about your sex. It's about an understanding of the human condition. And that is, I think, beautiful about our country and our civilization. So thank you.
Thank you, Monique. Fred, one quick reaction to that. Other countries, I don't know if this is where she was going exactly, but other countries have rebelled against U.S. culture erasing national identities as a defense of global diversity and cultural uniquenesses around the world, right? Now the U.S. is arguing, Trump is arguing, that immigration at a certain scale threatens things that are culturally valuable here and in Western Europe. Fair or just racist false equivalency, if you have an opinion about that?
Well, since the U.S. is actually the dominant power in all this, it is a little bit misleading. But, look, our country in some ways is a little different. I mean, we do, throughout our history, we have brought in and absorbed in many ways cultures. I mean, think of all the things that, some of the best things about our culture originated with people who are immigrants, starting with something that you and I have in common, the blues and jazz. If there weren't Africans coming to the United States, that this would not have happened on our own, and many other things. On her first point, it's instructive to remember that toward the end of the Biden administration, when Biden finally started to realize that the border was kind of a serious problem, he put forth very, very strict legislation. And Trump, who was then running to be elected again, urged the Republicans in Congress to vote it down because it would take away one of his big issues in the campaign. And so they voted it down, even though it actually met most of their demands.
Yeah.
So yeah, this is a lot of it is strict politics.
We're going to do a Venezuela tag to this segment when we come back in a minute with Fred Kaplan with the breaking news about new U.S., I guess you'd call it military action there, seizing an oil tanker off the coast of Venezuela, and what might come after that. Stay with us. Brian Lehrer on WNYC. A few more minutes with Fred Kaplan, the war stories columnist for Slate, covering military and foreign affairs. Let's talk about Venezuela. What do you know so far about why the U.S. seized an oil tanker off the Venezuelan coast?
Right. Well, I should first preface this by saying there's quite a bit about this that is still not publicly known. But I think it's a little bit misleading to refer to this incident as an escalation of the pressure toward war. I mean, it might be, and it might be used for that, but there has been cat and mouse operations involving Venezuelan oil tankers for quite some time. This ship that was intercepted the other day, there was in fact sanctions against that ship back in the Biden administration in 2022 because it was being used to provide oil to Cuba and Iran in violation of sanctions. There have been a lot of incidents more recently as well where Venezuela is engaged in prohibited operations of false flagging its tankers, of putting out radar signatures that are false. There was an incident just last month that wasn't covered much at all except in maritime trading journals of an oil tanker kind of eluding a U.S. destroyer that was tracking it off the coast of Venezuela. So this has been going on for a while. And
Why would an oil tanker do those things? I mean, an oil tanker is conducting commerce.
But it was conducting commerce with countries for which it was illegal to conduct commerce. For example, rightly or wrongly, Iran and Cuba, among others. Now, Venezuela does a lot of its business with those countries, and so to get that trade going, they have to behave deceptively. But what I'm saying is, an operation like this, it's conceivable. Again, we don't know everything about it, but it could have happened even if all the other stuff about Trump threatened over the
good context. Are you surprised that the opposition leader, Maria Corina Machado, who is not only the opposition leader in Venezuela, she seems to support Trump so much on his policies toward her country, and she just won the Nobel Peace Prize, by the way. Almost everyone does think Maduro is an autocrat and economically disastrous for his country as well. So what kind of coalition do you see against his reign?
Well, see, it's an interesting coalition. I mean, she won the election, and then he threw a coup basically to keep her out of office. So, I mean, on strict democratic grounds, there's a strong case for regime change, right? On the other, so there are some people, and I think Secretary of State Rubio is among them, given the constituency among Venezuelan exiles in Florida, where he was a senator, who support action against Maduro on democratic grounds. On the other hand, I mean, there is, I know of a consortium of economic interests, of hedge funds and others, which are planning revival of investment in Venezuela's oil and gas industries after Maduro leaves office one way or the other. They do have enormous oil and gas reserves, very, very little of which is being tapped now because of horrible economic inefficiencies and incompetence. So you have that constituency aiming, and then you have, the sort of America should control the Western Hemisphere, what is called in the national security strategy, the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. So you have lots of converging interests, and, Marie Corina Machado's interest, of course, is to get back in office and to restore democracy. I don't think Trump really cares that much about democracy, though if it furthers the rest of his interests, that's fine. Now, one danger of all this, and this was also highlighted in a BBC show this morning, is that because Trump his rhetoric is so active about military action against Venezuela, and we also have a carrier down in the Caribbean, a lot of troops, a lot of Marines, a lot of warships. This is in fact silencing some of the more centrist and leftist opposition to Maduro in Venezuela, because if they start criticizing Maduro, they can be accused of supporting, imperialist aggression from the north. And, there is a very long history of American intervention in Latin American countries, in fact, almost all of them over the last century. So when Maduro talks about the empire, which that's the way he always refers to the United States, there's a lot of historical resonance in what he's saying. And so it's like I remember when Secretary of State Condi Rice under George W. Bush, they actively passed a measure providing $75 million to democratic opposition movements in Iran. I mean, this was a horrible thing because every democratic opposition group in Iran, all the members were suddenly arrested for being CIA agents. So, some of what we do, especially when it's public and voluble and militant, can actually have counterproductive consequences as well.
Fred Kaplan, who writes the War Stories column for Slate and is author of The Bomb, Presidents, Generals, and the Secret History of Nuclear War, and many other books about U.S. military and foreign policy. Thank you for joining us.
Anytime.